How did you start out playing? Who were your influences? What kind of?
Well, I started when I was really young. My dad had brought home like a $15 folk guitar that he had gotten, and I was 7.5 years old. But I have an older brother, 5 years older than me, and all of his friends played guitar. And I grew up in an area just outside New York City called Far Rockaway. And there was a famous protest singer from there named Phil Oakes. And he was like our local hero because he made records and I mean, he was more important to the New York folk rock scene, that whole Greenwich Village thing, more important really than Bob Dylan because he actually, you know, lived there and nurtured that whole thing. So Phil's sister was a guitar teacher in my neighborhood. So my brother's friends would see me banging away on this cheap guitar, and so one of them just said, "Well, let me at least put it in tune for you, because you're making an awful racket, kid." So they put it in tune, and somehow, lo and behold, you know, I said, you know, well, show me how to play something, and at that time, folk music was really, really happening. You had James Taylor and Joni Mitchell and Simon and Garfunkel, and that's what all of my brother's friends played folk music, and then Hot Tuner, Jorma Kaukonen was a real big influence on all those guys. Because Far Rockaway, where I grew up, it was a beach area, so at night everyone would bring acoustic guitars down to the beach. You couldn't exactly, you know, bring a Marshall down there. So folk music was my first introduction. So one of my brother's friends said, you know, he's got some potential as a 7.5-year-old kid. You should try and see if Phil's sister, her name was Sunny, would give him lessons. So you know, it's something that I just love doing. You know, it wasn't like my parents said, "Hey, here's a guitar." You know, it was my dad's guitar, and little by little, it ended up in my room more than his. And then once I started to take lessons, I really dug it and put the time in. But it wasn't until I was 13 that I got an electric guitar. So my background is really folk guitar. Yeah, all of that kind of acoustic-based stuff that I've done. I did a whole flamenco guitar record. That's all because I didn't really play electric until years later. And then obviously when I got my first electric guitar, I was 13, and then that's Led Zeppelin, and Hendrix was a little bit before that. You know, I liked the guys that were. Hendrix had already passed away. I liked the guys that were currently making records, Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck, and then I remember the first time I put on the radio and I heard something from the Yes Fragile record, and for some reason it just resonated with me, because here was a guitar player in Yes, Steve Howe, who was playing all these different styles, like folk and classical and jazz and all this stuff, and these were all styles that I had taken lessons on. And he was the first guy I heard incorporate the stuff that I knew. And I remember by then playing, I had went out and got the Yes Fragile record, and you had Mood for a Day, all this kind of stuff, and then, for me, Steve Howe was the guy. And I got a guitar teacher who was the chorus teacher in my junior high, and I brought him the Fragile record, and he flipped out. I mean, he was a jazz guitar player from a different era, and he immediately recognized this brilliant guy who was doing all these styles. So I got into the whole progressive rock thing, and I was fortunate in New York at that time. There was a radio station that every Friday would play, their show was Things from England, and they'd play the latest Genesis thing and all this kind of stuff that you wouldn't hear on the radio, Gentle Giant even, all this kind of, crazy King Crimson stuff, and I went prog rock crazy, and that's still, to me, I guess, they say that the stuff that you grew up with at that time is still the stuff you love. So it's funny because a lot of the, when I tell people, I was like a prog rock head, they don't hear it in the Billy Idol stuff, but I think it's more the way that I arrange my guitar parts, and the fact that something like Eyes Without a Face is really acoustic based until the middle, And I've never been one of those guitar players that like gets a sound and plays and records that one guitar and that one sound through the whole song. I arrange it. I look at the guitar almost like an orchestra or something, and I think that comes from the prog stuff.
Yeah.
So that's my background, is folk and prog, you know.